the start of 1992, and Paul Cornell's first novel, Time Worm Revelation, had been seen as a huge step forward for the Virgin New Adventures, and so he became the first author commissioned to write a second book for the range. This time he was given a much bigger task than simply wrapping up an arc, however. Cornell had to write in a new companion. Welcome back to the Library of St John the Beheaded, a history of Doctor Who in prose. And today we'll be taking a look at Love and War. The change of companions has always been a key part of Doctor Who, dating back to the show's second season in 1964. While most Doctors are best remembered for their time with a specific companion, up until this point none had ever only just had one. The seventh Doctor was most well known alongside Ace, who continued with him into the New Adventures. But by Love and War, the ninth book in the series, she'd already doubled her number of Doctor Who stories, and so Peter Darvill-Evans came up with the idea of writing her out. Okay, let's be straight about this from the start. He also knew she'd be coming back, despite some encouragement to let her go for good. But the decision to give her a break was taken to highlight this was very much a new era of Doctor Who, with a different tone, and one not afraid of moving forwards. The books were aimed at an adult audience, so having a teenager as a main character felt wrong. Of course, this required the writing of a replacement, a new companion who wouldn't have a TV counterpart. This was a big step. There had been original companions in the comics, most famously John and Gillian, and Frobisher, the shape-shifting penguin, but these always occupied a strange continuity that ran alongside the TV show. The New Adventures were the official continuation of the series, and thus the new companion would effectively be a mainline companion whose importance sat alongside big names like Sarah Jane, Ian and Barbara, Romana and Chameleon. Other characters were tentatively considered as potential companions. We'll meet them in forthcoming books, but pretty early on Darvill-Evans made it clear to Paul Cornell that he would be the one writing in a new permanent character. And so he came up with Professor Bernice Summerfield, or Benny to her friends. Named after a school friend of his, whom he'd had somewhat of an interest in and who he once described as a force of nature, Bernice is a very different type of companion. Not that every TV companion had been young and or a screamer, but 30-year-old archaeologist Summerfield is already a traveller and an academic in her own right. When she joins the Doctor, it isn't by accident or as an escape, but is entirely on her own terms. She even lays them out at the end of the story. Cornell's initial outline was basically a female Indiana Jones. Mature, responsible, yet flawed and with a reckless side. Able to give a wise crack, although Benny's humour is generally more sarcastic than anything, and more than fond of booze. She can defeat her enemies with wit, and generally has a good control of her emotions, a sharp contrast with Ace, a character known for being explosive, both literally and emotionally. Benny was an immediate hit, and remained with the Virgin New Adventures for a long time, even becoming the star of them in later years, before heading up the first range of audios produced by Big Finish, in a series that is still running more than 25 years later, give or take a slight name change. Among the Doctor Who writers to name her as their favourite companion from the novels are Jonathan Blunt, Kate Orman, Lance Parkin, Jacqueline Rayner, Justin Richards and Gary Russell. She's also my favourite Doctor Who companion in any medium. Cornell's idea of how Benny would appear and sound was Emma Thompson in The Fall Guy, and so cover artist Lee Sullivan based his drawing of her on Thompson. The cover wasn't well received, I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe it was the Houthi, which Sullivan describes as a man in a rubber suit bollock monster, and he never created another cover for Virgin. However, his design lived on as the basis for the character in John Freeman's comic strips between 92 and 94. Gary Russell, then editor of Doctor Who magazine, wanted the comics and novels to work together as the ongoing arc of the series. Love and War had the working title of Heaven, with other possible ideas being Nightmare of the Houthi and Storming of Heaven. Alongside the prelude, including the main cast of characters on the planet Heaven, Doctor Who magazine 192 also featured an article introducing the character of Summerfield to its readers. In 2012, for its 20th anniversary, it became the first book to be adapted into an audio drama by Big Finish, As with others in the series, it loses something by cutting chunks for time, but it's worth listening to if only for what is arguably Sophie Aldred's finest performance as Ace near the end of the story. It came with an enhanced audiobook reading of the Doctor Who magazine prologue. Cornell was the first writer to experiment with form in how Doctor Who novels were presented, and while Love and War is nowhere near as unusual a novel as Time Worm Revelation, it does play with structure, especially opening with 2 prologues. The first prologue opens with 2 owls, in love, hunting at night, coming up with a poem about the car driving below. It goes, "Long ago, when love was real, an orange Allegro screeched round a corner, throwing up gravel on the single-track road. Its headlights caught a rabbit on the verge, and the animal hopped back into cover." Years later, Simon Messingham wrote a past Doctor adventure called The Tomb of Valdemar, in which Romana reads the very same poem and knows from the first line that it would be the worst thing she's ever read. I honestly don't know which of them is taking the piss, or if neither are, or both. It's certainly slightly rich of Messingham, given that he wrote Strange England. Owls reappear throughout the book, although I'm yet to fathom the real significance of them beyond pleasing conceptual continuity. It's been some time since the events of Nightshade. We aren't privy to the fallout of Ace and Robin's forced separation by the Doctor. They're on good terms now though, as he's taken her back to Perivale to a friend's funeral. Ace is growing up. She's learned not to be too nostalgic after her experience with the sentients, and chooses not to stick around for the wake. She and the Doctor depart in the TARDIS. He's in better spirits than the last time we saw him, but the ship is on the blink once more. Internal structure misbehaving, not landing where and when it should. This is a thematic prologue. It gives us foreshadowing for Ace's journey. Love and War is the first in a loose arc referred to by fans as the Future History arc. This was Peter Darvill-Evans's idea, based partly on an internal document outlining the rules and limitations of where and when the VNAs could go. It's as loose as arcs come, really, or a run of 6 books exploring the future of humanity in the Doctor Who universe. The second part of the prologue feels like an explicit start of this, a human ship on the edge of the Dalek War. Virgin couldn't secure the licence to use the Daleks themselves, so they just get a few passing mentions in the New Adventures. Here we get the idea of the extent of the war. This is the one that starts in the wake of 1973's story Frontier in Space, referring to the Battle of Alpha Centauri and passing close to Sontaran space. We also get a glimpse at a future where Silurians, Earth reptiles as the politically correct refer to them, fight alongside humans. They stumble across a skin-covered, moon-sized sphere rolling through space. It incapacitates them almost immediately. This is the narrative prologue that sets up the action plot of the main story. Love and War is set on the planet of Heaven, hence the book's working title. The planet formed a large part in the peace treaty between the Draconians and humans, Frontier in Space again there, as a neutral world that marked the border between the 2 empires, and a beautiful, if strategically useless, planet the 2 races could use to bury their dead. There's 2 types of continuity: fanwank, i.e. references for the sake of it, and world building, which uses past elements of the show to create new ideas. This is very much in the latter territory. It's successful and gives a rich history to the setting. The TARDIS lands on Heaven because the Doctor is after a forbidden book which can be found in a library there. Ace explores and immediately comes across a group of crusties, hippie New Age travellers with dreadlocks and boiled wool clothing. She's immediately attracted to one called Jan, or is it Jan? I think it's Jan. The most attractive human she's ever seen, who's also ugly at the same time. It happens. There's a chemistry between them immediately. However, Jan's polyamorous with a primary partner, and despite her not always positive experiences with anarchists and outsiders, this is still something Ace is not so comfortable with. Jan was also experimented on during his time in the military, leaving him with pyrotechnic powers, creating flames from his hands on a whim. Benny is on Heaven conducting an archaeological dig with a team who have nearly used up all their grant. They've found nothing yet, and she's wondering what to do next. The planet has ancient structures on it from an earlier unknown race, but it was entirely abandoned when it was first colonised, so it's a good place for an archaeologist to seek out a new find. She's made friends with the travellers, which is how all our heroes meet. We get a potted history of Benny. She grew up on Beta Caresis, lost her parents in the Dalek War. During an evacuation, her mum went back to collect her doll and was killed in the process. Her dad was lost in battle, and she was betrayed to Space Fleet authorities by her first boyfriend. She keeps a diary which she annotates and rewrites with post-it notes when she decides to change on how she remembers things. The 20th century is one of her specialist areas, handy that. The other is Martian culture. She says goddess as an exclamation and uses crooking as a swear word. It's alright, but Frau will always be my favourite fuck replacement. She's not a professor, she faked her qualifications, but she's very good at archaeology. She's intelligent, she reminds Ace of the Doctor, but she can mess up. Her middle name is Surprise. No, really. It's a busy book. By the third chapter we've met all the key players, the travellers have been chased by mercenaries, the mysterious history of heaven has been set up, a member of the Church of Vacuum has sacrificed himself to a weird amorphous creature, Ace has set her sights on Jan, the Doctor has been arrested, Benny's got drunk and started a sword fight, and we've been introduced to Pewter Space, a cybernetic virtual reality people plug themselves into, and a character called Christopher who has given up gender in favour of mental powers. Hold on, I thought Doctor Who only went woke in the last few years. And has warned that many, many deaths are on their way. Not bad for what is effectively episode 1 of a classic six-parter. Still, for all this, there's a relatively conventional story at heart. The sphere in the prologue, the creature receiving the sacrifice, and some strange material Benny finds are all clearly connected, consisting of these same white fibres. These are the Houthi. The Houthi and their silent gas dirigibles was a throwaway line in the brain of Morbius, expanded upon here to form a genuinely nasty enemy. A fungoid species, they absorb their prey, retaining the bodies at their centres as an ongoing source of sustenance, also absorbing their victims' memories at the same time. In some senses, they're not the most original creatures in Doctor Who. They're not so far removed from the crinoids with a touch of the Wirren to them. The consumption of memories is a very common trope in sci-fi horror, featuring in everything from The Thing to Red Dwarf's Epideme. What makes the Houthi memorable, however, is how grotesque they are. They're described with a full mind on body horror, emphasis on keeping original body inside to feed on exploding flesh, on controlling the possessed until they eventually turn into Houthi themselves. Their silent gas dirigibles are made of skin, the inner structures built out of muscle and bone, and the dirigibles are technically alive and enslaved. All the Houthi connected to a fungal network, meaning they're next to impossible to kill as individuals. Furthermore, they're incredibly clever. They're one step ahead of the Doctor the whole way. The events of the book have been planned for millennia. They've been slowly amassing a following, the Church of the Vacuum, who've been their representatives in the wider universe, spreading the word to different cultures that heaven is the best place to bury their dead. And with every body that's buried or simply left to land on the planet, another meal arrives to feed the Houthi, another set of memories, another host for the next Houthi to spawn from. As a species, they farm other sentient beings to live off. When they can't, they subsist off the corpses. The Time Lords tried to defeat them aeons ago. Seems to be a not uncommon thing that reappears a few more times in coming books. But with all that, the Houthi are just a backdrop. This is a story about the Doctor being manipulative to an extent he never has before. Of course, in the TV show he would be spinning plates with enemies, playing games of chess, always one step ahead. In 2 Season 26 stories it involves Ace, firstly in Ghostlight in order for her to face her fears, secondly in The Curse of Fenric to defeat Fenric, and in both cases she gets hurt, for which the Doctor is sorry. He miscalculates in Ghostlight, while it's Fenric who gets her involved in that second plot, and the Doctor disowns her as a desperate deception to win. In both situations he hasn't planned for her to be hurt. The level of manipulation Cornell writes into the character makes him much more dark here. It's fairly early on in Love and War that he realises he can use Jan to defeat the Houthi. He briefly tries to keep Ace away from Jan, but then quickly decides against it as his plan formulates. There are 2 different readings of his plan, the first directly from this book, the second from a later one. Neither reflects well on the Doctor, although the later retcon helps a little. He's not happy about what he has to do. He knows Ace won't forgive him, but he knows he has to do it anyway. Cornell doesn't hide this, that's why the Houthi are revealed at the start of Chapter 1. There's relatively little development in their plot. We learn a little about them, but basically they're just monsters of the week who are going to do a lot of killing. The emphasis is on the Doctor, Ace, Jan and Benny. In some ways this is the weakest part of the book. The Houthi are just kind of accepted as the villains. Everyone knows something bad will happen. Something bad happens, the Doctor has to stop the bad thing happening. There's so little emphasis on them that their side of it kind of underwhelms. and after them rumbling away in the background, a certainty but a vague one, the shift to a couple of very action-packed chapters filled with Houthi-possessed corpses brutally killing and taking over everybody in sight feels a bit unearned, maybe. Certainly a sharp change in tone, if nothing else. Because, of course, it's Jan who sacrifices himself to destroy the Houthi. Ace and Jan become closer and more intimate, spending a good chunk of the book together, and end up planning to leave heaven together on the TARDIS and get married, which is why the Doctor initially warned her away from Jan, knowing that he would die. It's written in a manner that still manages to take the reader by surprise, because this isn't a valiant charge into the belly of the beast at the last minute. Jan is taken over by the Houthi, effectively dying in the process, with a quarter of the book left to go. In the end, it's his link to pewter space that the Doctor uses to communicate with the last remains of himself inside the Houthi sphere. He uses his pyrotechnic skills to set light to the gaseous interior of the Houthi's home, burning them and their collective consciousness to death in a brief but enormous explosion. Only he, with his physical link to pewter space, his ability to create fire, and the determination to protect Ace due to their growing love, could have killed off the Houthi. The Doctor knows this, and so does Ace, and she's not happy. Given the task of writing Ace out, Paul Cornell went down the heartbreak route. It's one that's not so unfamiliar to fans of the first 10 series of the 2005 revival era of Doctor Who, but it rarely happened in the classic run. Certainly, in terms of long-running companions, departures were usually relatively mutual, someone finding somewhere they wanted to stay, or out of necessity. A couple of deaths aside, only really Tegan chose to leave because she was unhappy. So this feels fresh and new and horrible, the Doctor knowingly pushing the man Ace is in love with to sacrifice himself. So who can blame her for not wanting to carry on travelling with the Doctor? Of course, walking off and abandoning him in the far future on a planet soon to be abandoned itself, on a place once called heaven, may be a less wise decision. Still, it's a devastating farewell for a well-loved companion. Of course, Peter Darvill-Evans wouldn't let it lie, but that's something for a future video. Benny, of course, joins the Doctor, and in some ways it's the best story for her to join because she's seen him at his worst. She knows to be wary. She's not tactile and won't accept his hand on her shoulder. She's upfront about the fact that she doesn't yet consider him a friend. She's going with him because she ultimately believes he's a good person and maybe she can help him be more so. Their first adventure is to save the owls that would not survive the coming ecological changes on Heaven. They take them back to Earth. At the very point the book starts, with those very same owls watching over Ace and her young friend Julian and writing a poem, because that's a very Paul Cornell way to end a book. Love and War is chock full of continuity and references, some obvious, others quite obscure. They're generally thrown in casually rather than signposted, which is a much better way of doing things. For example, the Doctor mentions the IMC and the Spinwood Corporation, who both play bigger parts in upcoming novels. There's also the first reference to a name the Draconians have given the Doctor, the oncoming storm. I think I mentioned, at length, the influence Paul Cornell had on the revival series of Doctor Who in the Time Worm Revelation video, didn't I? One of the travellers is reading about Absalom Dark, Dalek Killer, a character from 80s Who comics. A member of Benny's archaeological team is called Paul Mars, also the name of Paul Cornell's friend, future Doctor Who author and, most importantly, creator of Iris Wildtime. Benny names a door after him. For a brief moment, the Doctor thinks he's the first Doctor and starts talking about Dodo. Once again, we get a snippet of the Doctor's description as he's never cruel or cowardly. Though he is caught up in violent events, he is a man of peace. This time a reminder to himself to be who he truly is at heart, despite his questionable actions on Heaven. Cornell also writes the tension and chemistry between Ace, Jan, and Jan's former partner, Roysha, brilliantly, a constantly playful battle of wits and attraction. Ace starts off desperate to kiss Jan, but he's so self-confident that she can't resist turning him down at first, just to see how he'll respond. Given that this is Ace's final story of her initial travels with the Doctor, indeed it's the last story with the Ace as we know her from TV, it's fitting that a lot of the book is written from her perspective. Cornell writes her brilliantly, cheeky, headstrong, yet niggled by the self-doubt of someone who knows life is more complex than people usually give it credit, reminiscing on Julian, her dead friend, her hopes to let go and unwind and let the Doctor deal with the monsters if only for a weekend. When she goes into pewter space, a computerised hallucinogenic used by the travellers as a healthier alternative to drugs, we get further insight. She questions why she hates her mum. She ponders her relationship with Sabalon Glitz. That probably raised more than a few eyebrows back in the day. And she doesn't want to die having left so much undone. She chooses not to change a thing about herself, well, she wouldn't, and is amused that Jan has buffed himself up and ruined his face by trying to perfect it. But when Christopher dies in pewter space, she's there for Jan. She's just come from a funeral herself, of course, and they spend the night together. It's strongly suggested that not only is this not her first time, but sex is something she has a lot of experience with, which doesn't quite track with how she's portrayed in the TV series, especially in The Curse of Fenric. Her music taste has changed a little again, this time Teenage Fan Club are mentioned. Benny is often described as being writer-proof. No matter whose hands she's in, she comes out as Benny. Ace is kind of the opposite. Every author writes her differently. Her age, personality, music taste, politics, even the era she comes from, even her surname at times. The things that define her are often the things that define the author. Trippy, surreal dreamscapes are exceptionally hard to write without ending up as incomprehensible drivel, and there's a fair amount of those to come in later books, but Cornell just about manages it here. It's all very early 90s, very cyberpunk, heading off into a kind of weird techno-optimism that will all be connected like this in the future, but with a darker underbelly. This is where hackers of hundreds of years into the future meet to break into governments and corporations, only they're connected by jack plugs inserted into their brains. Their travellers are there to talk to the gods, apparently. In many ways, pewter space is dated worse than anything else yet seen in the V&As. Its mix of hippie spirituality and surface-level cyberpunk imagery being very early 90s, and this kind of thing probably isn't Cornell's strength. But he still manages to make it comprehensible and relatively easy to follow. It never feels self-indulgent. Also, there's a strange prank-pulling character in there called the Trickster, who, through his use of "you wouldn't let it lie," is clearly Vic Reeves for some reason. At one point, a representative of the Church of Vacuum traps the Doctor and Ace in a pewter space memory. Firstly, of the Doctor's third self's death, in which we learn that, after leaving Metabilis 3, the Doctor spent 10 years in the TARDIS, slowly dying and decaying before eventually collapsing onto the floor at Unit HQ. And then Perivale in the 80s, where we find out a little more about Ace's childhood. Not the first or indeed second time we've visited that. This has all come from Julian, who has, with a weird coincidence, had his memories absorbed into pewter space. And I still don't know how that works. Speaking of trippy, surreal stuff, Love and War introduces some new concepts to the Doctor Who universe, the characters of death and time. The death we met in Time Worm Revelation was hallucinatory, although there was at least a suggestion that she was real. Here, Ace sees her in a dream at first. The Doctor has been speaking to Death's sister, Time, and has come to bargain. Death then reveals that the 7th Doctor is responsible for the death of the 6th, that this self intentionally flew into the Rani's beam so he could be born to act as Time's champion. The 6th Doctor's bitterness at being killed this way is what eventually causes the creation of the Valiard. Yes, okay, this is all terrible. I get the ideas, I quite like them in a way, but it's just impossible to read without realising it's a whole big load of fanwank. It's not the last time we'll see a different take on that regeneration. Anyway, while this could all seem easy to dismiss as just a dream, the Doctor and Christopher were also aware of it happening, and the Doctor references becoming Time's champion. So that all happened. You know, of all the changes in the revival series, the one that bothers me more than maybe it should is the Doctor being able to open the TARDIS door while it's in flight. Here it's mentioned as something that would cause the ship to force an emergency landing, and that explosive decompression would still happen. Take that, new series. Borrowing one of Ace's hairpins, the Doctor mentions having long hair is part of the job description of a companion, which probably explains why Polly left so soon after getting a haircut. Benny makes a remark that the Doctor acts badly. I don't know if this is a jab at McCoy's limited acting range, but it's quite amusing. The swearometer registers a bastard, a bugger and a shit. So, Paul Cornell's second Doctor Who novel. Do I love it, or am I declaring war on it? No, that's terrible, sorry. On first read, I gave Love and War 5 stars. I was a long-time supporter of the view that it's a masterpiece. I'm not so convinced anymore, though. The complete downplaying of the Who thief for the first 2/3 of the book, the slightly naff stuff in Pewter Space, the very first hints of Cornell's later tendencies to rely on coincidences and continuity references, it all just feels a little too knowing. Love and War is a book that's very aware of how clever it is. Which isn't to say it's bad in any way. The writing is broadly very beautiful, if not consistently as much as in Time Worm Revelation. As a character story, it's fantastic, taking the ultra-manipulative side of the Doctor, as first seen in Cornell's previous novel, and showing it up as something that's not always a good thing. He's gone a step too far here. It's almost a prototype Time Lord Victorious. Because just about every interesting idea and memorable scene from the revival series seems to have its roots in a Paul Cornell story. And yeah, the Houthi are a wonderful and grotesque creation. So there's lots to love, but I just feel it doesn't quite hold together as well as it could. As always, I'll end on some favourite quotes. Jan glanced up and suddenly spurred his horse towards her, out of the race. Benny closed her eyes and stood straight and relaxed, one arm out in front of her. In her fist she clenched a wilted flower. A sudden concussion, a quick leap, and she was riding behind Jan, the flower stuck behind his ear. "One day," she muttered, tapping the boy's shoulder, "you're going to get that extremely wrong." "And what'll happen to you then, Professor?" Jan laughed. Benny pretended to consider. "I shall die," she said, "having thrown myself under a horse. That's what you'll tell them I did anyway, and history's written by the winning side. Take me back to your tent and fill me with mead." Jan stood also, laughing and shaking his head. "Well, I have no idea what we just talked about. There is something you should know, though." He took a pace closer to the Doctor, his face serious. "I care about what happens to Ace. By God, I care about her." "Yes." The Doctor closed his eyes and put a hand gently on Jan's shoulder. "I believe you do. So do I. You just made my job so much more dangerous." "I could have changed it ages ago," the Doctor confided, "but I like the shape. And the motto, call here for help. That's what I do. I let little children sleep safely at night because I've searched through all the shadows and chased the baddies away. I'm what monsters have nightmares about." Some more news here is preempting there. By the time he got to Joycetown, Miller saw heaven as a trap, a big box baited for intelligence. It was a fable, a margin where things the great powers didn't like would be sent. Books, anarchists, the dead. They'd wanted to believe that there was somewhere safe these things could go, somewhere not in their backyard but still within reach if they needed them. But that wasn't true. When you put what you couldn't face out on the margins, it would putrefy and boil like an unfaced fear, and come back to hurt you. Miller imagined that the dead were carrying burning books and waving black banners. When he got to the stairway, he was ready to believe in it. Thank you once again for joining me for this video. Do feel free to like or comment down below or subscribe to my channel. In our next visit to the library of St John the Beheaded, we'll be taking a look at a very controversial novel indeed, Transit by Ben Aronovich, so I hope you'll join me for that one. Bye bye!